Aitkins, and this is St. Sarah's, and we're in Boston area. This is Arlington, right? Yeah. So, we're going to talk. I'm going to talk a little bit about the Greek concept, the ancient Greek concept of souls, death, and ritual. This is kind of building off of what we did last month with the Egyptian concept of these ideas, the Egyptian ideas of souls and death, and the afterlife, death ritual, and all the rest of this sort of thing. This is the Greek stuff, and I'm going to follow this loosely through certain aspects of Greek religion and follow it up into some ideas in early Christianity, particularly in the Gospel of Mary, and make some comparisons and some contrasts between some of the ideas about death, life after death, the human soul, and how they're kind of at the foundation of some early Christian thought. And interesting, possibly, if we all afterwards sat around and speculated a little bit about how some of these ideas have carried forward into the modern world, because these ideas aren't dead. Like a lot of our modern world, I would argue, was especially the ideas of death and the afterlife and immortality, are based very much on some of these ideas we're going to be talking about here tonight, as well as some of the Egyptian ideas that we talked about last month. So, the very beginning, I'm going to talk a little bit about this to give us a background so we can get some traction to take off further up. In ancient Greek thought, of course, death was once viewed as a frightening inevitability, and that was about it. The afterlife was a very gloomy place, and there was really not much hope after death. But around the 6th century BCE, I'm not exactly sure why, but this changed, and people started looking for a happier afterlife. It's been speculated probably the anxiety of upcoming death and no hope has probably led to people having happier thoughts about death. That seems reasonable to me. But it's interesting because death and life start getting ambiguous about that point. They start to imitate each other. And one of the themes that I'm going to be tracing through this is how this ambiguity crosses back and forth between this invisible line of life and death. This ambiguity itself does definitely carry over in the early Christian thought. And as an example for some of the ambiguity that we have in Greek thought, early Greek thought before Christianity, I think it's an extreme example from the Anglo-War pushing things out. An ancient Greek philosopher named Pyrrho basically tried to refuse to make no distinctions between life and death. He tried to keep a very distant view on everything. So this was kind of, for some Greek philosophers and religious practitioners, this was kind of seen as an ideal. So I'll start a little bit about animal sacrifice, which was very central to Greek religion. And then we'll go on from there to focusing on some thoughts that go through the half of Greek religion that is basically centered around the cults of the dead and how it's built up from there. There are other aspects to Greek religion that focus on the pantheons and the gods, but we're going to focus on this is more directly related to what we're trying to talk about. The gods do come into this, though. Animal sacrifice, basically, it was a big party, right? If they sacrificed an animal, there was a parade, the animal sacrifice, and it was feasted upon. The animal was dressed up, everybody dressed up in their best garb, they showed up, it was a big fest. The sacrifice, the animal had to give its permission to be sacrificed. And the way they did this is, as they led the animal up to the altar at the end of the parade, there would be a bar that it would have to bow its head down to go under as it was being led up. That was the symbolic acquiescence to be sacrificed for the people. So if you think a little bit here about this crossover between life and death, is it just beginning to get a little bit ambiguous? They're treating the animal as if it's a person. They need permission from the animal, and so they're sort of like deifying this animal to be something more than it is in a way. But also, this centered around the death of the animal is centered on the senses of the human being. The taste of the meat, the smell of the blood and the incense and all the ritual that would be going on, the sight of the parade, the feel of the clothes, the emotions and the excitement that would be going on in your body as this thing is going on. All of this stuff is part of the religious process that's going on in animal sacrifice. And it's centered around the death of the animal. So this height of living in a body is being focused on this death of an animal. These things you can't separate them at this point. So I'm going to move on a little bit here to talk a little bit about the cult of the dead. One of the major halves that some people have argued in Greek religion is the notion of the cult of the dead. And that ties up into the cult of the hero cults. And almost all, if not all, of the sacred sites of ancient Greek religion, you have two aspects of a religious site. Half of the site is, or part of the site is dedicated to somebody or all of the Olympian gods, and then another part of the site has a hero's grave. They all have heroes' graves. Whether there's a body there or not is totally irrelevant. There's a grave there that's dedicated to a hero. And the religion and the way these two are approached is different. So in the cult of the dead, when a person dies, usually a very important person, there's oftentimes, and you have to laugh because it's kind of sad in a way, a lot of the mourners were killed. There was a mass murder. And many of the mourners and many other people, along with sacrificed animals, as we just mentioned, will be buried along with the important person who's being buried. And
I'm sorry, what of the mourners?
They were killed and buried.
I know, but you're saying many of these mourners were killed. Would it be like family members or just like?
I believe so, actually. And a lot of the actually at the time, it was mostly a job of women to do the mourning. Okay. So it would have been probably, my guess is it would have been probably mostly women.
Okay.
At the time. And then the funerary requirement of the animal sacrifices, which would have been more of the fixing of the life and death we mentioned before. But some of the other things that's going on, especially with the funeral, is more of a mixing of this ambiguous interconnection of life and death. The descendants and the dead support each other now. In this cult, the point of the cult of the dead is that the descendants and the living support each other. And this is a similar pattern we find around the world. The descendants support the dead, they feed the dead, and they keep the graves kept up. They take care of the dead in that manner. They pour libations to the dead, and they talk to the dead. And these libations and prayers are a form of communication between the living and the dead. The dead support the living by answering those prayers, but they also support the living by the inheritance that the descendants who have survived the mass murder end up getting. And of course, a lot of the gifts that the central dead person is being buried with comes out of the inheritance. So again, this crossover is becoming really, really important. A version of the cult of the dead, or the hero cults that I mentioned earlier, is very similar to the cult of the dead. And dead heroes perform further functions that are associated with life. Dead heroes are expected to defend the city, heal people, and perform the killing that the gods required. Now, as an interesting aside, the ancient Greek gods did no killing. They're associated with death. They're oftentimes pictured around dead things. But the gods never kill anything. You always get a person to kill. And usually, and oftentimes at some point, the person who did that killing became a hero and was central to the local cult, to that particular god or goddess. So as we move on from here, I'm going to move into Eleusis. If any of you know, I'm slightly obsessed with Eleusis, the mysteries of Eleusis. I don't know if you guys know that about me now. It's a big mystery. It's truly a mystery. We know so many details about it. We still don't know what the whole point of it was. It went on forever. We even know the names of the two families that were strongly associated with keeping the mysteries going for centuries and centuries, even after Christianity took over. The mysteries, the rites of Eleusis, didn't actually change anybody's life outside of the fact that they celebrated the rites. It provided nobody any real special status in the culture. Anybody who spoke Greek and could get to Eleusis could be, at the right time, could be initiated into Eleusis, into the Eleusinian mysteries. Those were the requirements. Even slaves, which is especially rare. It did, however, give you class status after you died. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. But again, socioeconomic class status with these rites at Eleusis and the sort of status it gives you after death becomes very, very important.
So you're
as
saying
a crossover
with the
between life
slaves,
and
it's
death.
very rare. Is that because they couldn't speak the language or because they couldn't get there?
No, specifically it's rare for slaves to be initiated in any mystery cult. Eleusis was a big exception. They would initiate any slave that could speak Greek and could get to the site.
So you're saying that some of them couldn't speak Greek?
Yeah, anybody who couldn't speak Greek could not be initiated.
Okay.
That was pretty much a central requirement. So the myth and the rite, and then when you talk about these initiations, they're usually centered around a myth. Oftentimes a myth is very specific to the rite, so we can't escape talking about Eleusis without talking about the myth, especially when we're talking about life and death. It becomes very important. The myth of Persephone being carried off into the underworld, kidnapped from her mother Demeter, the goddess Demeter, is the whole point that the whole rites exist, right? So Demeter is a mother goddess and sort of the goddess of the sun and agriculture, not the sun, but of agriculture and all that. Persephone is her daughter, who will end up becoming the queen of the underworld. But she's too young to really be a goddess of anything specific right now at this point. And Pluto, or Hades, who's a god of the underworld, brother to Zeus, decided that he needed a wife. Zeus kind of turned to gave Hades permission to come up and kidnap this girl. So I'm going to read a little quote here. The story opens. Well, before I get to that, this myth contrasts innocence and sex on one side with life and death on the other. Innocence and sex mixing with life and death in a very strange way here, but it's super, super interesting and really opens up to a lot of speculation, very interesting insights. The story opens with the daughter playing as a child in a meadow with her friends, many of whom will later become divinities themselves. They're just little girls. Persephone plucks a flower, and all hell breaks loose. It's a joke. Hades literally rises up out of the ground on a chariot, kidnaps the innocent goddess. This kidnapping suggests a forced marriage and rape. The connection of the sexual loss of innocence with the realization of the individual's death is quite clear, not only with the rape of Persephone, but also in her act of plucking the flower. The beauty of a flower is meant to attract, and beauty is always short-lived. But to pull it from the earth, to claim that flower, to try to own the apex of life itself, is to kill it at the same time. Sexual activity, or the self-conscious realization of one's innocence, turns attention away from the immediate present and into the inevitable future of decline and death. So, an aspect that we know that was probably related with the Eleusinian initiate survival into the comes a little bit from one of my favorite comedies, Aristophanes' The Frogs. It's pretty funny. It's a story about Hermes going down into the underworld, and a large part of the story is where he runs across the Eleusinian initiates, the dead Eleusinian initiates, and their little special area in Hades. So the afterlife, of course, I said before, is gloomy. And Aristophanes describes the dead as being suspended in feces. The uninitiated dead literally live in feces. But the Eleusinian initiated dead exist in sunlight. They play music. They eat. And they're constantly repeating the Eleusinian mysteries themselves. They're on parade, they eat. There's jokes in there about Hermes who needs to go forth, and he smells the meat and he gets hungry. That's how Hermes is. And
That's
he
great.
has to eat. So he goes down from hiding and tries to get the food from them and everything. So, some of the interesting crossover here with the socioeconomic class. This is a highly stratified society. There's no escaping it. Is that, I mean, you can see here, when you got initiated into Eleusis in the material existence, in material life, when you were in the rites, class wasn't supposed to exist. Everybody, as you were being initiated, was an initiate, and they marched side by side down the parade, and they did all the things, and they stopped at all the sites. They looked for Persephone with torches, and they went into the Telesterion, and they went through the mystery and the instruction and heard the stories. They did that all together, and then the rest of their lives, that was it. They went back to their old life. But in the afterlife, you were a higher class of dead. And actually, in the story of Aristophanes the Frog, physical laborers are described as being corpses, living or dead. It's very interesting. So here we start seeing this hope for life as we're living it now, as hopefully being continued and carried over into the afterworld. This should start to sound familiar to anybody who's grown up with the Christian background in our culture, right? I mean, this doesn't seem too mysterious at all. Many of us were literally told when we were growing up, when you die, you'll go to heaven and you'll sing God's praises forever and ever in the light of God. A lot of these details are right in here. So another thing that's usually coming up here, and something that's probably a little bit more interesting on the philosophical side, because you can't separate philosophy from religion in the ancient Greek world. Events in life have a permanent effect in death. You go through the rites, you learn, as we get to the Orphics here in a second, what you learn also has to be carried over. But what's important and interesting here is that the soul has more to do with the individual's identity than their body. The soul is the source of who you are, and if you carry that identity over via your soul into the afterworld, and the effects that rites or rituals have had on your soul, then it will affect how you live for the rest of the rest of existence and death. So the Orphics. I don't know if another small.
Wait a
Go
minute.
ahead, yeah.
Does being inducted in these rites then holds more power than how you live your life at this time?
How do you mean?
Living your life piously.
Yeah,
That doesn't
wasn't
really
the
make a
concern. That wasn't the
difference
concern
at
for
that time.
Eleusis.
Okay.
That comes with the Orphics.
And, okay.
But not with the other. There's no
With
dogma
Eleusis.
associated with Eleusis. There's just a
And
story in the rite.
for a person of slavery, you could die at a higher level than someone with more wealth.
Well, I mean, you
It's
will still die as a slave.
You would still die as a slave.
And then when you're in the afterworld, then you're in the class
In
of
the
Eleusinian
afterworld,
initiates.
you would be at a higher level than someone of wealth who had not been
Right.
initiated.
Right, running on the assumption
Okay.
that it's nice to be in the sunlight in the dead lands, yeah.
All right.
Which I think is a safe assumption, yeah. So moving on to Orphism and Orphics, which is a spin-off that goes on further, and we're going to start hearing more about Plato here, because it's strongly suggested that Plato is not just initiated at Eleusis, but has probably also been through the Orphic initiations as well. I'm going to start out here with a little bit about the central myth of Orphism, to kind of explain what's coming on a little bit further. Things are going to start sounding more familiar to Gnostic types, like everybody in the room here. This story centers around Dionysus, Zeus, and Titans. And the Titans, Zeus, of course, is the father of the gods. Dionysus is the half-man, half-god in some stories. In this story, that's not quite as important. He's still the son of Zeus. And his mother is actually Persephone, the queen of the dead that we met at Eleusis. And the Titans are the generation of divinities that came before the Olympian gods, who are Zeus and Dionysus and Demeter and all the rest of that. So here I'll read this out. Orphics also strongly emphasized preparation in this life in order to claim a positive afterlife as reward. A myth found in the Rhapsodies tells that Dionysius, son of Zeus, was eaten by the Titans. Zeus destroys them with a thunderbolt, and humanity rises from the ashes. In his commentaries on Plato's Phaedo, Olympiodorus explains that this means that humans have both Titanic and Dionysian qualities. Life can be seen as punishment for the Titanic destruction of Dionysius. Dionysius is also the son of Persephone, queen of the underworld. As humanity is the result of her son's death, it is a source of grief for the queen of the underworld, and each human being must make amends individually to her for her pain. While punishment is not specific to Orphic thought, it is central to it. In order to bypass this inevitable punishment in the afterlife, Orphics must perform the proper ritual in order to gain salvation, so that they can get their way past Persephone, literally, in some descriptions, past her in Pluto's mansion, so that they can go to a better place, a better area in the afterlife. This salvation, hold on, back up here. Okay, yes, so this salvation exists because of an Orphic idea as presented by Plato in his Cratylus. This is some very interesting stuff, and if you're into Kabbalah and wordplay, you're going to dig this. This is based on the distinction between the Greek words soma and sema. Very similar words, right? There's only one letter of difference between them. Soma, which means body, has an omicron, and sema, which means tomb, has an eta. Death separates soul out of the body, because the body is the tomb for the soul in this life. When you die, the soul is released from the body, and then the soul has its own existence. This is a point in philosophy, and a lot of philosophers are pointing this out, especially Plato. The separation of the soul from the body while you're still living the life of this body is the point of philosophy. That's it. It's not about anything else. You want to live as, and not all philosophical schools, but many philosophical schools did something like this, which is where we get a lot of our spiritual exercises today. As a matter of fact, a lot of the Christian monastics adapted this ideal, where the whole point is to live your life as close to death as possible, so that when death happens, you'll be aware of it. You won't be taken off guard. You will be conscious, and your memory and your idea will cross over with you. which is of course associated with your soul, right? So humans are made from Titans, the Titans' physical remains. They must pay Persephone for her grief, as I already pointed out, but also, and here's an interesting idea for us, suffering is inherent in our bodies, because our bodies come from the Titans, and the Titans are what? Big, strong monsters who are motivated by hunger and revenge and sex and all the rest of this. Fear, that's what they do, that's who they are. And that suffering is inherent in our bodies, which is our tomb. So it's speculated, we don't know much about the Orphic afterlife, but it's speculated that the afterlife is probably very similar to where a lot of heroes lived when they weren't busy defending the polis in their own little area in a backwater way past Pluto, Pluto and Persephone's mansions. But we don't know much about those places. And salvation was dependent upon self-control and knowledge. An example of self-control or living your life in a sort of, from the Orphic point of view, in a very ethical way, was they were big fans of vegetarianism. That's just an example. And they did not sacrifice animals. Very, very strange for Greek religion, right? Because most of Greek religion up to this time is centered around the animal sacrifice. And of course, they had to have the right knowledge. The right knowledge came through the Orphic initiation, which we don't know anything about. There's speculation from a little bit of the literature that we have, but we can only guess. The literature that we have are called golden leaves or golden tablets. They're little thin pieces, they're so cool. They're little thin pieces of gold leaf that are printed on in Greek. It's a mnemonic, we believe it's a mnemonic device that has the story that reminds you that when you die, you can read it, you can look at it. And it gives you the password to get past the Guardian, to get past Pluto, and drink the waters of remembrance, as opposed to the waters of death or of forgetting, which is what everybody else who's suspended in shit has done. So, one of the, and you probably have heard me say this before, one of the famous things about the golden leaves is to get past the Guardian, you have to declare who you are. You have to give them your identity, which is associated with your soul and not your body. And your identity is given by giving your lineage. And the lineage is this famous quote, I am a child of earth and starry heavens, and my race is of heaven. Or similarly, I am a child of earth and starry sky, and my name is Starry. That was what you told the Guardian when he hopped out from behind the tree and tried to keep you from going down one path. So here we see that the Orphics have almost completely flipped life and death. Life, not for the Orphics, but for the philosophers, especially with Plato, and everybody else is affected by Plato afterwards, right? Life is preparation for death. The point of life is to die well. And the Orphic afterlife is speculated that perhaps the Orphic afterlife is what life would have been if Dionysus hadn't been eaten and killed by the Titans. If you know anything about Dionysus, this suggests a couple of strange things. But they sound like more fun to me than going to work every day. So, to sum up the Orphics, the body was a tomb, and the state of existence within it was a punishment for the body's very existence, while existence outside the body in the underworld held the potential to be a reward for correct knowledge and experience gained in the life of the body. Memory of the self, or self-knowledge, sustained the individual through the process of dying, and brought him or her to the promised existence greater than life itself. So memory and self-knowledge is all very central. Gnostic thought should be churning here right now, right? Yeah. It's all about wisdom and insight, and the gnosis. So, yay, Gospel of Mary, hurrah! I like the Gospel of Mary, it's one of my favorites. Okay, so the Gospel of Mary, obviously a Christian text. Jesus is never named. He's always a Savior. He's never named as Jesus. Yeah, the Soter. Half of it's missing. What we have is pretty interesting and revealing. What we have doesn't really tell us much about the nature of the soul, but a large section of it tells us about how to prepare for the soul ascent and what the Gospel of Mary's version of the soul ascent is. And so we'll talk a little bit about the soul ascent at the end of this. I'm sure you guys have heard me prattle on about this one before too. Gospel of Mary's soul ascent is pretty easy compared to a lot of books I've tried to understand. Probably well, one of the things you need to understand about the soul ascent is that it can be pre-mortem or post-mortem. Originally, soul ascents were probably something that happened after death. But pre-mortem also suggests we also have to know that some schools of thought and religious groups and cults practice visionary practices where they would do something like an ascent, where they would go to the spheres of the planets or the spheres of the powers or the archons or whatever you want to, whatever that school called it. But that was probably also done in preparation for it. Calm down, calm down. So I'm going to read, this is a longer read here, but understand that the crossover here between the Orphics and the Gnostics, or the early Christians, I'll just put it this way, is ritual instructions which teach you how to live your life here and how to perform the soul ascent. And there are hints in the soul ascent about how you probably should be living your life here. This afterlife journey contains guardians or powers who require that the deceased speak correctly to them so that they may successfully pass on, as was the common belief in that part of the world, including amongst the Orphics, as I already mentioned. Soul ascents would have been what we nowadays call common sense. Most people, everybody knew what a soul ascent was, and if you joined a group, it was assumed that that cult or group had something like a soul ascent as part of their thought. It sounds strange to us, but it was normal back then. The power of desire, which is sort of like what some people call an archon, claims that the human soul cannot leave because it never descended to the material world. This is an accusation that the human is of the earth, but in order to pass, the soul must correct the power, and in doing so reveals its true spiritual nature by denying its material nature. As is found in the golden tablets of the Orphics, the soul must declare its spiritual genealogy in order to prove itself worthy of continuing. At one point, the power of wrath makes its challenge that the soul is conquering and murderous, and the soul replies that it has cast off the requirements for those activities, specifically desire, ignorance, and the body. The Christian soul also claims to be free from forgetfulness, much as the Orphic soul must make sure to do when it begins its travels in the underworlds by having these instructions on the golden tablet and from drinking from the waters of memory. However, most important for connecting these early Christians to Orphic belief is the moment of the challenge of the power of ignorance. This power claims the human soul is wicked, and the soul replies the soul, is not material and therefore has no fault in it. This is a reference to the Gospel of Mary, page 3, verse 3, when Jesus says, quote, "There is no such thing as sin. There's no such thing as sin. It is material that gives the illusion of sin. But sin ceases when the material fails." This obviously compares to the Orphic notion, as related by Plato, that the body is a tomb. In fact, the notion that the body is a tomb was common knowledge at the time, part of the cultural context of the Gospel of Mary was written in. This is also common sense. These early Christians might relate that the material body is both inherently ignorant and of this world, and that perfect existence is possible only after death has occurred. By experiencing proper ritual in life, these Christians believed they might remember their true selves after dying, and that the self-knowledge would carry them through lifelike adventures until they reach the ultimate goal of their spiritual homeland, much as the Greek Orphics believed. And as another aside, we don't know anything, we know very little about the Orphic's goal of the soul, and we know very little about the goal of the soul in the Gospel of Mary, and also another interesting point. Just that there is a goal, that's what we know. So this to me is a last philosophical outlook, Plato and some other philosophers, who viewed death as the act of looking down over all of human experience. They gave detachment and objectivity, thereby abolishing small-mindedness, which is the philosophical interpretation of the soul ascent, I would say. Okay, I hope that wasn't too long.
Bravo.
No.
Was that good?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.